Hi, everyone. I'm Lissy Medvedow, Executive Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College Law School. We are going to wait a minute or so to let more people join, and then we will begin. Thanks for being here.
Sorry, did you read my text?
No.
Read my text. I have another meeting. I have 3 more meetings today. It's absolutely brutal. I'm hopping on now.
Ew.
Okay, I think I'm going to start. Along with Dan Canstrom, the faculty director at the Rappaport Center, and Cindy Wynn, our administrative assistant, welcome to today's debate, really a conversation about ranked choice voting. As you all undoubtedly know, ranked choice voting is question 2 on the Massachusetts ballot. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, as of September of this year, 67 bills have been introduced in 22 states and Washington, D.C. to use ranked choice voting in elections at various levels. This system of voting, which engenders, I apologize, this system of voting, which engenders varying degrees of controversy and challenges, is currently being used in Maine for both state and federal elections, as well as in local elections across the country. In Cambridge, our own Cambridge, Massachusetts, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland in California, Tacoma Park in Maryland, Minneapolis, Santa Fe, and New York City starting in 2021, among some other cities. Ranked choice voting is not a partisan issue. Folks on both sides of the aisles are on both sides of the issue. So what does ranked choice voting really mean, and how does it work? That's what we're here to find out today. Our program is intended to help each of us become a more educated and informed voter on or before November 3rd, whenever we're voting. So let me introduce our panelists and moderator. I'm starting with Evan FALCHUK, a lawyer and chair of the Yes Unto campaign. Evan is a business and political entrepreneur. In 2014, notably, he ran for governor of this Commonwealth as a member of the United Independent Party, which he founded. From 1999 to 2013, he was the president of Best Doctors Incorporated, which is a global expert medical opinion company, which he grew from a small startup to a more than 200 million in revenue company. Today, Evan is the CEO of another healthcare startup, VillagePlan, which brings expert help to families who are caring for their seniors and aging loved ones. Evan started his career in Washington, D.C. as what I would call, in quotes, a real lawyer, a practicing lawyer, in a firm where he focused on SEC enforcement. He's a graduate of Lehigh University, Phi Beta Kappa, and got his JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Representing the no on question 2 is Jennifer BRACERAS, also a lawyer, as well as a columnist and political analyst. Jennifer currently serves as director of the Independent Women's Law Center, a project of the Independent Women's Forum. She comments frequently on issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture, and her writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe. Following her graduation from Harvard Law School, she clerked in the U.S. District Court here in Massachusetts for wonderful Judge Young and in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Earlier in her career, Jennifer was also a real lawyer, practicing lawyer at Ropes and Gray, where she focused on labor and employment law. She's also served as an adjunct professor of civil rights and constitutional law at BC Law School, as well as Suffolk Law School, and she was a former commissioner of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, having been appointed by President George W. Bush. She is a graduate of the University of Massachusetts, where she has been a trustee, and I might note, Jennifer is here in her individual capacity The Independent Women's Law Center and Independent Women's Forum takes no position on Massachusetts Question 2. Our moderator, Sue O'Connell, probably needs no introduction because she's a media star. She is a commentator and analyst at New England Cable News, as well as the co-publisher of Bay Windows, New England's largest newspaper serving the LGBTQ+ community, and the South End News, a Boston weekly. She appears regularly on GBH's, formerly known as WGBH, Boston Public Radio, and Under the Radar with Callie Crossley, and is a host of Lunch Hour Live, a GBH social media broadcast. In 2019, Boston Magazine named her Best TV News Host, and in 2018 recognized her as an influencer, making her cool. Sue began her career as music director of KISS 108 and later as program director and marketing director at WBOS. She is a graduate of Emerson College. And before I turn the program over to her, there are two logistical points I need to make. One, we are recording this program so people can watch later. The second, we are reserving about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So if you have Q&A, please put your questions in the Q&A function box, and we will get to them later. Now, I welcome Evan, Jennifer, and Sue. And Sue, I am turning it over to you.
Great, Lissy. Thank you so much, and thanks for the kind introduction. I think I should probably note that right after I got that the day before I got that Boston Magazine honor, my show was canceled. So it was sort of a bittersweet memory, but thanks for bringing it up. I want to welcome you to this conversation. We all know each other. I don't have a clock. I don't have any plexiglass. We'll probably have some dogs barking, but no flies. So we're just going to have a general conversation talking about the great question that we're here to talk about, question 2. Evan, I'm going to start with you. If you could tell me in real people words, what question 2, why you have put question 2 on the ballot, and what the intention is, what you're thinking about it, and why do we need it?
Thanks, Sue. So ranked choice voting, question 2, is the culmination of years of work by thousands of volunteers across the Commonwealth who are responding to the problem that so many people talk about of feeling like you got to hold your nose and vote for the lesser of two evils in elections. Feeling as if you want to vote for someone that you really like, but worrying that your vote might be wasted. And what we want is a system where voters are able to vote their hopes and not their fears, where people are free to run without being told that they're a spoiler, where voters feel free to vote for people who they truly like, and where we do a good job of figuring out what the majority of voters really want. So question 2 implements ranked choice voting, but it also helps fix our democracy.
Jennifer, are you against ranked choice voting? Are you against different ways of voting, or are you just against this question? And if so, why and how?
I'm against this particular question, and I'm against ranked choice voting generally. Usually when people talk about ranked choice voting, one of the main arguments they give in favor of it is that when you have a multiple candidate field, that often the person who wins didn't achieve a majority. And so, you know, the majority of people actually voted for somebody else. So why is this person our nominee or the winner of our election? And the problem with ranked choice voting, well, there are multiple problems with it, which we can get into. But the problem with it is it doesn't actually solve that particular problem. It doesn't create a majority. It creates a faux majority because when people rank their ballots, they may or may not choose to rank everybody on the list. And so as a result, many ballots get exhausted. And what ranked choice voting essentially is an instant runoff that occurs behind closed doors when you don't get to go back and make that choice a second time. So I think the long and short of it is, for me, if you're trying to solve the problem of not having candidates who received a majority of votes, there are other solutions to that, including runoff elections, that can solve that particular problem in a much less complicated way and in a way that isn't as confusing and doesn't create faux majorities.
Evan, can you get into the meat of that a little bit and talk about, can you tell us what the definition of an exhausted ballot is? Can you talk about the numbers of, you know, if you have to vote for all the people on the ballot, when with the quote unquote, when your vote wouldn't count as it moves forward in the process? Can you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, and so the viewers know, I mean, the arguments that Jen's raising have been raised over and over again in the state of Maine against ranked choice voting, and courts that have ruled on the issues that she's talking about have rejected those arguments over and over again. So to take the example of what we're talking about as exhausted ballots, is this notion that if I don't rank enough people, maybe my ballot will have no names on it by the time it gets to the counting of that round. And that can happen, although the data show it's in a very limited number of cases. But in the 4th Congressional District Democratic primary that many of us, I mean, I live in the 4th Congressional District, there were 9 great candidates in that race. The winner got 22%, so to the point that Jen was raising, that means that 78% of people didn't vote for Jake Auchincloss, who won, who's a big supporter of ranked choice voting, by the way. And if we were thinking about what were the exhausted ballots in that race, 56% of the ballots in that race didn't have either Jake's name on it or the second place finisher, Jesse Mermel, who's also a big supporter of ranked choice voting. So, you know, as with many of these arguments, you can always come up with interesting, you know, mathematically valid reasons why ranked choice voting could have a problem. And on the other side of the scale, you've got the mountain of evidence of bad things that happen under our current system. And so, you know, to me, I don't, what we like to say all the time is that ranked choice voting doesn't solve all of our problems, but it helps. And it's something that we can do today, now, to make an impact on our democracy and make it better.
If I could just respond, you know, it's not just a mathematical chance that this exhaustion problem can happen. It actually does happen. So in San Francisco, in one of their municipal elections, they went through so many balloting, you know, so many rounds, that there were more votes that were exhausted than there were actually in the final round cast for the winner. So the winner had 4,000 some odd votes, and there were over 9,000 ballots that had been exhausted. So those 9,000 or more voters never had a chance to participate in the final decision, right? Their ballots were discarded. And I think when you talk about it in terms of practicality, I think you begin to see why it's complicated and why it doesn't work, right? So I appreciate the things that Evan is saying, what the problems are with the system, and I appreciate the objectives of ranked choice voting and what it's trying to do. It's just that in the end, it's not really as simple as saying, you know, I'll have a chocolate ice cream cone, and if they're out of chocolate, I'll take the vanilla, and if they're out of vanilla, I'll have mocha or coffee, but definitely don't give me pistachio, right? Because that's not how it works. That's how it's explained, but that's not how it works, because ranked choice voting actually requires voters to have a level of knowledge about all of the candidates that they're never actually going to have. So what it's really asking them to do, right, a voter might really like candidate A, really dislike candidate E, but not know too much about candidates B, C, and D, right? So asking them to rank them is like asking, you know, a customer who's never tried mocha or coffee to rank those flavors. And so then you get into the problem of voters making choices based on very little information. And that becomes problematic, not to mention the whole strategic aspect of how you rank them.
We're getting some questions in, but I want to give Evan a chance to respond to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's important because I think Jen is talking about, you said San Francisco, but I think you're talking about the election in Oakland, where there were 7 candidates. And the problem, the reason why that happened, what you're talking about, where there were, you're right, there were 9,000, but it's because there were 7 candidates and they only let people rank 3. And so it was a flaw in the design that they've since fixed. So that cannot happen again in Oakland where
Well,
that took
it
place.
can because some people will always choose not to rank some, right?
I understand, but that's a very different thing.
But
If I could just finish.
if you have 7 candidates, there are always going to be some that either you despise or that you don't know enough about to give them your vote.
Evan, go ahead and finish. Let Evan.
Yeah, I just wanted to finish my point that, the other thing is that I actually have a much higher opinion of voters than what is being described here, because I think voters are actually pretty smart and pretty sophisticated. And in the 4th congressional district race where there were 9 candidates, 2 of them dropped out because they were worried that they were splitting the vote with ideologically similar candidates. I can tell you that this was a hard-fought race in this district. And voters were really struggling to figure out, not just this is the candidate that I like, but the question was, if I vote for that person, will it mean that this other person will get a leg up that they shouldn't have? And that's not fair. And what we ought to have is a system where you get to rank your choices and where we can get a reflection of the true will of the voters. Is it perfect? No, nothing is. It's human. But it's far better than what we have today.
Evan, we got a question again. I know we answered it, but I want to make sure folks are clear on this. An exhausted ballot means that exactly what does an exhausted ballot mean?
It means that you've not ranked a candidate and there's no one left for you to vote for in the counting. So it's the circumstance in which your ballot no longer has a choice on it. And it happens all the time in our current plurality system. It can also happen in a ranked choice system, but it happens much more often in plurality elections when we've got multiple candidates.
Let's just give it like a concrete example of that. Let's say we had ranked choice voting in this recent congressional election.
Okay.
And so let's say that you as the voter go in and you rank 4 people who you really like, but for whatever reason, you don't like either Jake or Jesse and you don't put them down at all. You don't give them your vote. You put 4 other people down. Ultimately, that ballot becomes exhausted because the 2 finalists in the instant runoff are Jake and Jesse. And so you don't have a chance to participate in that choice. However, if that same election were run with a runoff, if we had the election as it were held, and then we said, well, you know what, nobody got a majority, so we're going to do a runoff between Jake and Jesse, then even people who didn't necessarily care for them to begin with would have a chance to reconsider and say, as between those 2, who do I like best, or who's the lesser of 2 evils? And you have a chance to go back and make your voice heard. But with ranked choice voting, if you don't like them enough to put them down the first time, you never get a chance to choose between them.
What's the engagement? How does ranked choice voting, where it exists, how does it impact voter engagement, voter turnout? How does it impact how many people run for office? Some of the measures that we use when we look at our democracy to say that it's working, not in a partisan way, but just in an engagement. Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of data that voter participation goes up, more candidates run, there's more choices for voters, and there's a lot of data that show that voters find it to be simple and easy and they like it. The congressional race in Maine in 2018, there was a super majority of people who said it was simple and I liked it. In all the different places around the country that Lissy mentioned at the beginning, there's a tremendous amount of data that show that people like ranked choice voting. And look, if we want to talk about runoff elections, it's puzzling because there's tons of data that show that fewer voters, like as much as 35 to 40% fewer voters show up for the second round of a ranked choice. That's their choice.
With ranked choice, it's really not their choice.
Just let them finish, Jennifer.
Yeah, so what we really need to do is get out of this trap that we've been in of saying we've got to pick between the lesser of 2 evils. We have to make sure our democracy works in a way that encourages voters to participate, that drives consensus among candidates, that seeks to broaden coalitions of support, and not one that incentivizes the division that all too often characterizes our politics today.
Jennifer, the challenge I have in thinking about ranked choice voting is on a regular basis. I'm a highly informed voter, right? And I think I've probably only missed 3 or 4 elections in my entire life. And one was on the day my mother was buried, and I knew she was really mad at me that I didn't get to the poll first, right? Because it's big sin in our household not to vote. And on a regular basis, I will go into the ballot and look and go, who the heck is this person? Or
Exactly.
I don't understand this question at all. Or, you know, why is this up for election? Why is the standard for ranked choice voting that we have to be so such as sophisticated when on a regular basis most of us aren't? So isn't more choice an idea that it would keep us more engaged and to learn more? And on a regular basis, my candidates don't win.
Right.
You know, so my ballot gets exhausted both in the general and in the final sometimes.
Right. Well, those are good points. And, you know, you could make the argument that ranked choice voting encourages voters to, you know, to go back to my ice cream analogy, to try all the flavors and to educate themselves about all the candidates. And that's a positive thing for our democracy. And I certainly appreciate that. I just think the reality is that's not going to happen. People, you know, even sophisticated voters are too busy to sometimes drill down on 7 or 9 candidates like that. And that's just the reality. So I think it exacerbates a problem that already exists. It certainly doesn't fix it. And so, you know, I think it's best when voters have a chance to make a binary choice and compare 2 candidates. Now, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate what they're trying to do here. I'm a conservative. I have a lot of friends, I call them never Trump conservatives, who aren't happy with this president and would be inclined, you know, as Jeff Jacoby wrote in the Globe the other day, to vote libertarian in this election. But many of them aren't going to do that for the very reasons Evan said, because if they do that, they're throwing the election to the Democrats. And with these voters,
I want to get back to you, Evan, and talk a little bit about, and both of you agree that this is a nonpartisan issue. Both sides have lists of both Republicans and Democrats who think it's a good idea or a bad idea, and organizations. So it's definitely not a partisan issue. But Evan, there has been some data that show that folks in minority communities and other communities of care and concern may not be fans of ranked choice voting. How do you address that?
I haven't seen any study that shows that. In fact, quite the opposite. It's actually increased voter turnout in places with large numbers of people of color living there. It's increased representation. We have support and endorsements from a number of organizations that spend their time working on voting rights issues, such as Mass Vote, such as Amplify Latinx, such as the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, and others.
there's just as many
Tanisha Sullivan, the head.
Hold on one second, Jennifer. Go ahead.
I'm just reciting facts. Tanisha Sullivan, the head of the Boston branch of the NAACP, former Governor Deval Patrick, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. I mean, the list goes on and on. These are folks who have spent their time and lives dedicated to the proposition that we need to do everything we can to secure everybody's voting rights. So it's simply not supported in any way by data or by the real world experience of the people supporting this campaign.
There are studies that show that senior citizens, Blacks and Latinos, have a disproportionate share of their ballots disqualified. And in fact, there's a study that shows San Francisco has seen lower voter turnouts in communities of color since adopting the system. I will also add that, you know, you say survey data shows people like it, and I'm sure in some places people do, but there are many communities that have repealed it because it was too complex, it was too confusing, and it led to bizarre results. Ann Arbor, Michigan is one of those places. Burlington, Vermont is another, although it's back on the ballot there. The state of North Carolina repealed it. So there are lots of, Aspen, Colorado, there are lots of places who implemented it because it sounded good, but when they actually went and implemented it, the voters were confused, it was complicated, it took multiple days to get the results, and it just became, you know, more of a headache than it was worth.
Evan, I want
It's-
to ask about other parties as well. I mean, one of the examples that I usually go to when talking about ranked choice voting is actually Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Ross Perot, where Bill Clinton won without a majority of the votes. And in many elections, when you have a third-party candidate or a quote-unquote spoiler, the result is often not a majority person who gets they don't get the majority of the votes. I'm wondering if you hear from other parties that often feel left out of this two-party system, which was not the intention of the founders. You know, not long through George Washington's term did suddenly parties emerge, much to their horror. But what are you hearing from other parties other than Democrats and Republicans around ranked choice voting?
A few things. I mean, one of them is that, look, it's true that it opens up our system and gives voters more choices. There's no question about it, because there's no more spoilers and no more wasted votes. But one of the challenges we have in our democracy is that people are using disingenuous arguments and things that aren't really true to argue matters of public policy. So, you know, Ann Arbor, Michigan, that ranked choice system there was repealed by some entrenched interest after they elected their first Black mayor, which didn't sit well with some people. In the state of Maine, where this argument was made about older voters having their ballots disqualified, there was an expert brought in, and I don't think I've ever read an opinion where a judge eviscerated both the report of the expert on that point as well as the expert himself. Quite so badly. So, I mean, let's have a genuine discussion about the pros and cons of ranked choice voting, but using the facts.
Well, those are the facts, Evan. I don't think that's fair, because the truth is, I am acknowledging and have acknowledged that you've made some very good points. That was why I brought in the example from the Republican side about why, you know, people of my political viewpoint might favor this. I definitely understand what it's trying to accomplish, and I think there are some very good arguments in favor. I'm simply saying that in the final analysis, the costs do not outweigh the benefits. And everything I'm saying, you know, my arguments are based on fact. You don't have to agree with them. Obviously, you think the benefits outweigh the cost, but don't say I'm being disingenuous in making my arguments. My arguments are fact-based. You just don't happen to agree with them.
Well, they're not, unfortunately. I mean, the older voters argument has been disproven.
Okay.
It has been.
This is the ballot that was used in Maine, okay? And you can see how this is an example of somebody filling it out incorrectly. This ballot was confusing to a lot of people in Maine, and there were many ballots like this that were thrown out because of the overvotes, just like the one I'm showing you. So it's not true that people weren't confused by it. They were. And it did take Maine 9 days to tally the results. And many senior citizens were upset because they found the ballots confusing, just as they found the ballots in Palm Beach confusing in 2020. And that is why Democratic governors Gavin Newsom and Jerry Brown have vetoed this measure, because they both said at the time that they vetoed it that they felt it had a disparate impact on disadvantaged communities, and that they wanted to make voting easier, not more complicated.
Evan?
So there's a lot to unpack there. Maine has voted for this repeatedly, in spite of efforts to repeal it. It's been voted repeatedly. It happens to be the oldest state in the nation in terms of the average age, but the effort to show that this was systematically discriminating against older voters, which is what the expert attempted to show, was roundly and soundly rejected by the judge looking at the expert's attempt at a report. There just isn't evidence that there's something confusing about a ballot that requires people to rank, or that there's more overvotes or undervotes than there are in a regular election. And as for, you know, Gavin Newsom and Jerry Brown, you know, every state has a right to select their elections any way they want. And what California has done is they've also moved away from the plurality voting system and have gone for a top two finisher system. And what they rejected were efforts to change that and create local options, which for California specific reasons, that's what they decided to do. And candidly, both Brown and Newsom had issues personally with having lost elections in ranked choice settings. But we don't have to look to California governors, because we've got former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick endorsing this, and former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld endorsing this. So it is something that is good. It works. It is simple and fair and easy. There are voters and data from across the country that show that voters like this. There's a wonderful letter to the editor from Minnesota that a 92-year-old gentleman wrote recently, where he had seen the argument that older voters had trouble with it, and he described how much that bothered him and how proudly he was, casting a ranked choice ballot. Voters are smart, and I think they're able to handle this level of additional insight.
So we have a lot of questions from the audience, and Lissy, I'm gonna go to them, and some of them are a little detail oriented, which I think is important to try and clear up, because I know folks have a lot of questions about the ballot. So I'm just gonna kind of plow through these in no particular order, if that's okay with everyone. One question is there evidence that ranked choice voting, where it's been used, favors left liberal voters over traditional conservative voters, or is it a wash?
There's not evidence that it benefits one political stripe or another. What it benefits is candidates who will spend their time trying to build coalitions across political and ideological lines. So I can tell you, like when I ran for governor as an independent back in 2014, if I was knocking on doors and I saw a sign for another candidate in front of that house, it is of no use to me to go knock on that person's door. Whereas in a ranked choice election, I will go knock on that door, and I will find ways to agree with that voter and get them to consider me as their second choice. So at the end of the day, what does ranked choice voting benefit? It benefits the voters.
Jennifer, you'd agree that this is sort of a wash when it comes to which party?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And that's why I was giving the example of the Libertarian versus Trump, because most people often look at it in terms of a Green Party candidate on the left, a Ralph Nader type of spoiler, quote unquote. And I just wanted to illustrate that it doesn't favor one side or the other. And I do agree with Evan's point about, when you're going door to door and you would ignore that house if you saw a sign, whereas with ranked choice voting, you wouldn't. And that's a definite advantage of the system. There's no question about that.
All right, we've got a lot of questions about the
My problem is how complicated it is, and the strategy required to rank your ballot effectively to actually do what you want it to do.
Our drinking game word for this meeting is exhausted, and exhausted ballots keeps coming up. So I'm going to try and see if I can combine a couple of questions here. Wouldn't the exhausted ballots not have counted anyway because their choices didn't gather a majority? So I voted for someone in the Democratic primary in Mass 04 in the 4th district. It wasn't the guy who won, and I'm out of luck and I don't feel like voting anymore. Isn't that exactly kind of what happens anyway, I think is the question?
Well, unless there's a runoff, in which case you have a chance to come back and then make your second choice, right? So I think that the solution to the problems we're talking about is a runoff election. That would be a cleaner way to address some of the same problems.
So a follow-up to that is, are you suggesting, Jennifer, that multiple elections for runoff elections wherever a candidate doesn't garner 50%, so voters would have to keep going back to the polls? So in order to solve the problem of not getting a majority or not having your vote count, are you saying that each election, if you don't get 50%, you just keep going to the polls until you get there?
Well, and not for presidential elections. I'm not talking about that. But with every other election, yes, I would suggest a runoff.
Well, I mean, so that's not on the ballot.
No, of course not.
We've got 170,000 voters across Massachusetts who signed for this. We've got endorsements. You talk about the different parties. The state Democratic Party has endorsed this, as has the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. As has Secretary of State Bill Galvin. So there's, the voters truly benefit from this, and the evidence from all the places it's been used show that it works.
Okay, here's a question. This is for you, Jennifer.
Okay.
The debate is ultimately not a vote for or against ranked choice voting, but rather it is a question of adopting a system that allows voters more choices or keeping our current system, which denies that added level of choice. The data shows that our current system has so many problems with ballots being wasted and voters feeling disinclined or even facing barriers to voting in runoff elections. Why should we preserve the current method as it is when these problems are cyclical and reoccurring in every single election?
Because this will lead to more problems. It leads to lack of finality in elections. It's, you know, we have elections right now that require recounts that are close, that there are allegations of fraud or this or that, and we have to go and recount. You know how hard it is to recount when you're doing a ranked choice voting thing? And the transparency, by the way, is not there, because it doesn't happen on a precinct by precinct level with people counting 1, 2, 3. This is an algebraic formula that's done by a computer behind closed doors, or, you know, if it's not done by a computer, it's formulaic. It has to be done on the district or state level. It cannot be done on the precincts level. And so it's less transparent and therefore more susceptible to corruption.
Evan?
Well, look, we've spent over the last few years a lot of time with both Secretary Galvin and his team and with clerks all across the Commonwealth. And they're more than capable of handling this. And it is exceedingly transparent, candidly, in terms of how this works. Our voting machines in Massachusetts are almost all capable of handling ranked choice ballots today. There may be some upgrades needed, but it's doable. There'll be an initial count, which happens just like it currently does. If someone has more than 50% of the vote, the election is over. If no one does have 50% of the vote, then the data is transmitted and delivered to the Secretary of State's office, and then the count happens there. It is not a computer algorithm. It's essentially an Excel spreadsheet. And what's cool about a ranked choice election is that all that data will be available publicly. And that's been the way it's worked all around the country, is that the data of all those choices and all the interesting things you learn about what voters' preferences truly are entirely available. Now, Jen mentioned before that it took 9 days to get an answer in Maine. Well, the reason it took 9 days in that first election was that the Secretary of State decided to wait 9 days to do the final count because of a number of idiosyncratic things about delivering the sort of hand-counted ballots from remote islands and other places in Maine. The more recent ones have happened much quicker. You could do it quite quickly and just as quickly as any other election in order to come up with the result. And again, if
one of the concerns I have, just in general, is about our ability just to count the votes that we have. And I'm not at all against changing things or trying new things, but I was horrified to see the number of uncounted ballots in the 4th Congressional District. I was horrified to learn that the Secretary of State had to actually engage a lawsuit in order to force the clerks to count the ballots. Like, I had no idea they didn't have to count the ballots. So I'm also off the heels of the marijuana legalization ballot question, which was filled many pages and filled with lots of detail on how long it took the state in order to enact what that law was passed. What are the tools and the sticks and the carrots that you have in this question in this law, if it passes, to help make the town clerks and the state do what the law is asking them to do?
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years talking with the Secretary of State's office and with the clerks and helping them understand what's needed and what needs to take place. And look, there's no question there's lots of upgrades that need to happen in our democracy. I mean, our country is in need of some work. Ranked choice voting is part of the solution to that. But in terms of the ability to do this, you know, the federal government had appropriated $40 million in funds under something called HAVA, which is an election modernization account. Those funds are available right now to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to use for election modernization. And perhaps the experience of the 4th Congressional District with those ballots is an opportunity to do this. But what I will say is two things. One of them is that those folks, the clerks, the Secretary of State's office running these elections that they just did in the midst of the pandemic, I give them a lot of credit. I know that there were some issues, but these are These are underappreciated public servants that are doing hard work. And the second thing is, this ballot question passes this November. The first ranked choice election isn't until 2022. So there's a lot of time and a lot of opportunity to both educate and do all the activities that are needed to make this a success.
So Jennifer, a lot of people think our election system doesn't work for a variety of reasons in a nonpartisan way: electoral college, voter turnout, barriers to voting. But we don't often get an opportunity to actually have a ballot question or a law that changes things in any way, to even try. I mean, this is the great experiment, the American democracy, an experiment every moment. Why shouldn't we be experimenting to see if we can find a way to make voting more equitable and have people feel more engaged?
Well, we're experimenting with the experiment by voting, right? I mean, maybe it'll pass, in which case we'll have the experiment, or maybe it won't. I mean, that'll be up to the people, right? So, you know, if it passes, I'm very interested to see how it works out. My sense is that people aren't going to be happy with it, that there is going to be confusion, that there is going to be, you know, complications and all of the things I've mentioned. But, you know, if people want to try this, I mean, yeah, I'm all for democracy. So if the people vote for it, then let's give it a go. I'm not against allowing people to choose whether or not to have ranked choice voting. I just, you know, my choice is going to be no. And I think that a majority of people will say no, but whatever the voters choose is fine with me.
You know, it's interesting. You both seem to agree on runoffs in some degree. Is there room for agreement on how a runoff and ranked choice voting would work together? I know that's not on the ballot, but just in the terms of the exercise of how we vote and what would work in a better model?
Well, it wouldn't work together because ranked choice voting is in lieu of a runoff. It's what it is an instant runoff that occurs automatically. And you have to, because you have to make those choices from behind the veil of ignorance, if you will, without knowing who the last two candidates standing are going to be. There's a lot of strategy and game theory, if you really wanted to effectuate your voice, that would go into that. Because lots of times, the person you might like second or third, just in terms of how much you like that candidate or person, could end up knocking out your first choice. So there's a strategy that goes into it. Most people won't bother to engage in that strategy, but actually what I predict will happen is that special interest groups and unions will invest time, and political parties to some extent, in making those strategic calculations. And then they'll spend a lot of money telling people, this is the order you need to use. This is the way to do it. And so, you know, I don't think it's going to force people to educate themselves and go and get degrees in game theory to figure out how they want to do this.
Evan, a question. If ranked choice encourages more candidates, does this make campaigns harder to cover and debates like the initial Republican and Democratic presidential just more complicated?
I mean, we have that problem today.
Yeah.
If there are 9 people in a race like there were in the 4th congressional district, it's hard. What's worse, though, is that, I mean, the point about the gaming things out, in a ranked choice election, you actually don't have to game it out because your second or third choice cannot hurt your first choice.
Yes, they can.
So, no, I don't understand how. Mathematically, it's not possible. In the current system, you do have that problem. Absolutely. You know, and by the way, back to the runoff point, we will have both forms of elections in Massachusetts. We'll be able to compare them side by side. So for example, in Boston, the mayor's race is top 2 runoff finishers. But back in 2013, it was a very interesting race because you had, 12 candidates, 13 candidates running. And there was a tremendous amount of pressure on the candidates that were of color to drop out and consolidate behind one candidate of color to go against the top 2 finishers. And it's an example of what happens in these kind of winner take all systems where in a ranked choice election, you could just vote for who you like. You could vote for who you like always and never have to worry about what it means for those that you don't.
Jennifer, do you like the caucus system? I mean, from the primary, I mean, here in the state of Massachusetts, we also have a, state party caucus that happens. Many of us spent a very long night in Iowa with the caucus, waiting for the results there. I'm actually not against waiting a long time for results, but is caucus too confusing for folks to do?
I don't love the caucus system. I mean, I think people should vote, and I think the first to the finish line should be the winner. That's the cleanest way. That's the simplest way. And I'm not saying that other ways aren't valid or that other states don't have a right to try things different ways or other parties. That's all fine. And of course, there are pros and cons to every system. Our current system does need some repairs. It's not perfect. Neither is ranked choice voting. And people just need to think and decide, they're not choosing between an imperfect system and a perfect system. They're choosing between two imperfect systems. And you need to weigh the pros and cons and determine, who you think has the better argument and where the better system lies.
Evan, Jennifer raised the point about, I hate to call them outside interests because sometimes they are actually the interest, but outside parties, PACs, groups, do you see that ranked choice voting would have any impact on their involvement? I know we keep looking at the 4th just because it's fresh, but I know the fight to get endorsements from some of those progressive groups within that slate of candidates was brutal. Do you see that maybe these organizations would raise more money and endorse more candidates, or it would diminish their impact?
They can still, and look, if there's money in politics and the level that there is today, it's obviously still going to be involved in one form or another. In the current system, what's worse is that you can put all your money behind one candidate with a view towards getting a plurality. And so, that becomes the game, and it's totally winner take all. This does level the playing field. I agree with Jen, and I've said this, from the beginning. This is not a perfect system. This does not solve all of our problems, but it is something that we can do today, now, that makes things better than it was. And I think that's true on the money point. There was a race in California where the winner in the mayoral race, I believe it was in Oakland, it raised much less money than her primary challenger. So, maybe it helps level the playing field, but money in politics is a problem that is not going away until we make some other kinds of changes.
I mean, we're still getting a couple of questions just about the mechanics. So using the 4 of us, the 3 of us, Sue, Jennifer, and Evan, if we were running for office and I was going to end up coming in last, how would that work out? If somebody voted for me and voted for Jen,
you would never come in last.
Well,
I know. Let's use a more realistic example. So let's say
you would crush us, Evan.
I know that. So that's where I'm going to say, let's say it is the 3 of us, and people are voting for you first, Sue.
I'm
Jen
definitely
second.
last, Sue.
No, you're second. You're second in my story. You're second, and I'm coming in last. Okay. If we do the counting in the first round of counting, and you have 55% of the votes, Sue, it's over. The ranked choice does not come into effect. If you have 40% and Jen has 35% and I have 25%, I'm eliminated. So I'm out. But everybody who voted for me, now their second choice counts, and those votes get redistributed. And of course, you would end up the winner, Sue, as we've already decided. But
I have elections, but I'm going to win. So
right, but the point is that I would spend my time as a candidate talking to Jen's supporters and your supporters and saying, hey, let's talk about ways in which we agree. Where do we have common ground? Could you please consider me as your second choice? In the hopes that I could get enough support in order to have a chance to win. But it would change the dynamics of the race, and again, with 3 people, it's very straightforward.
To support Evan's point, and be the devil's advocate to myself, you do see that happening in Maine, right? So you see the Green Party candidates saying, vote for me, but vote for Sarah Gideon second, right? So you don't see the Green Party candidate and the Democratic Party candidate attacking each other. There's a sort of a symbiosis there, and they can work together and what have you. And again, I appreciate that as being one of the benefits, but I do think that it can lead to kind of funky outcomes. And you know, there have been some articles that talked about this lately. You used to like to mention Ross Perot and the Bill Clinton election, but think back to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln barely got 40% of the vote. And he was a very sectional candidate, right? And, or not a sectional candidate, but a narrow candidate in terms of the slice of people he was appealing to. And, you know, if we had had ranked choice voting, it's very possible that Stephen Douglas would have been president, because he might have been a lot of people's second choice because he wanted to compromise, right? And so we might have had a very different outcome with respect to this country. And, you know, maybe people say, well, that's okay. It would have been more of a consensus of where the country actually was. And it would have been, you know, it would have given voice to the people's true aspirations. But that's an outcome that I don't think looking back, we would have wanted. I think the outcome we want is the person, you know, who gets the most votes, or in that case, the most electoral college votes.
So Evan, can you talk a little bit about filling out the ballot completely, and Jen, you too, but the bullet voting? I mean, my daughter is a new voter, and we live in Boston, and when she went to vote in the Boston City Council primary, I told her how many she could vote for, and she said, what if I don't want to vote for all of them?
Right.
You know, is that wrong? Am I going to get arrested? All sorts of questions. And I said, no, it's called bullet voting. They do it in South Boston every single election. But you're not required to vote for everyone on the ballot. There is, for some high sophisticated voters, a strategy to how they do it. Does that impact ranked choice voting in any way?
Yeah, there would be no incentive to do the bullet voting. And of course, the elections this would affect are these single winner, so state legislative races, the state constitutional offices, and U.S. Congress and U.S. House. And yeah, for younger voters especially, what we found is there's a great deal of interest in ranked choice voting. I mean, voters, the younger ones especially, want more choices. And they're very comfortable with the ability to say, well, I like this first, I like this second, I like this third. I mean, it's, again, I think everybody across all age groups like this, but if you go to yesonto.rcd.com, you can see examples of what ranked choice ballots look like. And you can see some of the endorsements and you know, some of the folks, especially the young people that are so involved in this campaign to make it into a reality.
Again, though, the reality is that those voters, particularly the young people, many of them aren't going to educate themselves about all 9 candidates, and you're asking them to rank, you know, mocha and coffee without ever having tried it. I mean, that's the truth, or to leave them blank. And that's
how is that different than what really happens now, though, which is sort of my question. When we look at the statistics of low information voters who vote all the time. I mean, I've stood outside of polls in New Hampshire, both Democratic voters and Republican voters, and asked them to say one policy that their candidate would impact their personal lives, and almost none of them could tell me why they were voting, voting for Elizabeth.
Dude, that's a problem. This just makes it worse. It just makes it worse, because when there are 2 candidates, you're likely to have heard something about both of them. And when there are 9 candidates, there are many candidates you're likely to have heard nothing about. And so it just exacerbates the problem.
Yeah, I have a much higher opinion of voters. I also believe that we can expect more from voters in terms of educating themselves. But I also think one thing is really important about our current system is that when everybody's playing the game of how do I get a plurality in a 9-person race, how do I get 22%? It's all about what we see on TV all the time. Find your base, get your base out, get those base voters out there, and don't worry about everybody else. So what every candidate is doing is saying, let me identify my base and let me depress the vote from the other candidates' bases. And that leaves huge numbers of voters untouched, and no one's really interested in seeing them vote. In a ranked choice election, there's a tremendous incentive for every single candidate to educate every single voter about themselves, and not to do it by throwing negative attacks, but rather saying positive things about what their vision is for the future. So, you know, I think that anytime we can make reforms in our country that encourage good citizenship, good behavior, and I'm talking about encouraging voters to pay attention, encouraging candidates to reach out to voters, encouraging candidates to talk to each other and not try to beat up each other, I think that makes for a better country, and that's what question 2 is all about.
And I think that anytime you make voting more complicated, it it hurts our democracy. And I think voting should be as simple and as clean as possible and as accessible to as many people as possible.
Well, I appreciate you both. Lissy, thanks. You want to come on in? What a great conversation. I think I got to a lot of the questions. I tried to combine them if I could. I'm just going to double check and see. It really, it's a great joy and pleasure to speak with both of you in this format. Lizzie, I still have more questions, but I feel smarter.
Thank you, everyone. I think we have addressed pretty much all of the questions that were asked. And I think we have all learned a great deal today. And I hope everybody is better educated, more informed. And really what I hope and what everyone keeps saying is vote. Go out and vote. Whether you are voting for or against ranked choice voting, do be sure to vote. Today, tomorrow, or anytime up till November 3rd. So Evan, Jennifer, Sue, you're fabulous. Thank you, all three of you. On behalf of the Rappaport Center, really thanks so much for your time and effort and doing this for us. We appreciate it. We like to be informed voters.
Thanks for putting it together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Real pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Take care. Stay well.